So always, hey Latin 2 students, thank you guys for heading back to see me today. And I want to go over chapter 35 with you today. Yesterday I introduced the vocab, and to be honest, this chapter is a heavy vocab chapter. It's mostly vocab, so there's not a lot of complex grammar for me to teach you this chapter. The notes will go pretty quickly because yesterday we actually did like the heavy lifting on the vocabulary. The reason for that is because this chapter is all about irregular comparison of adjectives. So it's the things you have to learn, the vocab, the positive, the comparative and superlative of certain words that are irregular. They'll make this chapter kind of a lot. So if you can study the vocab nice and early, get the vocab down, that's the biggest part of the chapter. There's not a lot of constructions or grammar again in the chapter. It's one of those chapters that there's vocabulary to learn. Okay, but I will take you through it. I'll try to explain, but it's definitely a chapter to study the vocab nice and early and often. I've already shared the Quizlet with you, so hopefully you've already been studying for that part of it. Now, let me get started here. Okay, here we go. So these words, a lot of you saw in the vocab yesterday, but I'm just laying them out for you here so you can see how these work. These are basically the very irregular words, right? Last chapter they were a little bit irregular. For example, pulcher to pulcherimus or something. That's a little irregular, right? These ones, though, bear very little relation to the positive. For example, bonus is a word we learned in Latin 1. The comparative of bonus you learned yesterday, melior, melius. Why do they look so different? Well, it's actually the same way in English, isn't it? Good, and the comparative is better. Better looks nothing like good, but it's just something you've inherently known since you were younger, and it's kind of makes sense now. But the English here, the comparative is actually also very irregular, just like the Latin is, right? So you got to learn these kind of going across. Bonus, melior, optimus. These three actually go together, even though they look nothing like each other. And we already talked about the derivatives yesterday, so we'll go into those right now. But just know that these three are connected, even though they don't look that similar. Same thing with malus, meaning bad. This comparative is peor, peus, and which means worse. And then pessimus, the superlative, means worst. Again, these three are connected, even though the positive doesn't bear a close resemblance to the comparative or superlative. Okay, all of these are on your vocab yesterday. I'm just kind of trying to connect them now. And let me get myself out of the way here. The next one is magnus. Of course, we've had since Latin 1, meaning big. And major is the comparative, meaning larger, maius. And then maximus is a superlative, meaning largest. Again, pretty irregular there. If these were regular, you could do them just like the last couple chapters. Bonus, bonior, bonio. It's not like that though, right? That would be the regular form. So on the quiz, watch out for that, right? If I tell you, hey, the comparative is malior is one of the choices, I'm seeing if you know this. I'm seeing if you know these are irregular. Another word is, come on, there it is, parvus. Parva, parvu means small, of course. You've known that since Latin 1. The comparative is irregular though, minor, minus. Notice how it's not minior, but it's minor. And then the superlative is minimus, which means smallest. Okay. It's kind of interesting that these are the most irregular ones, but notice how just normal these adjectives are, how common, I should say, right? Good, bad, small, large. The reason for this is actually not a coincidence. And the words in most languages that are used the most tend to be the most irregular because they're on people's lips a lot, they come out of our mouths a lot, and they just turn to evolve because they're spoken the most. Whereas words that are rare, words you only say every now and again, right? Think about how often you say the word, I don't know, adapt or something. It's not a rare word, but it's certainly not a word you say as much as good or is, right? So it's the common words in most languages that actually end up being the most irregular. And that's why the word good is regular in English too, because it's so common. So there's actually some cool connections here to English. And the last of these famous 5 irregulars, these are kind of the most irregular words, would be multi. The comparative here goes to plures plura, and the superlative goes to plurimi, ia. There's a little bit more in the chapter about how to say on the next slide, how to say more in Latin that I'll go into, but just know these 5 are very regular. Now this whole thing is laid out on page 199, so you can look there also. That's in your notes. I would definitely recommend using your book along with my notes this chapter. Again, it's mostly vocab. You'll notice that there's some adjectives that don't have a positive, but they do have a comparative and superlative, and those are right there in the middle of the page at page 199. So for those, it's mainly learning the vocab. For example, the first one is exterior, which we did yesterday, meaning outer, and then superlative is extremus. You need to know those go together, and they don't have a positive that they refer back to. Okay, so that's pretty important. Let's see. Now, a little note on how to say more in Latin, right? There's actually two words we learn in this chapter that mean more. I guess three technically, but one of them was actually the only noun in this chapter, which is plus plurus, neuter meaning more. Okay, so this word means more when you're talking about something singular. It can only be used in the singular. So I want more money or give me more water. These are instances that you would use plus. Okay, you would not say plus for um, we need more quizzes. That's a plural thing, and so it would not go with plus. Notice how it also takes partitive genitive, okay, which means the word after will be genitive, very similar to how when we saw nihil, if you remember in a previous chapter, always taking genitive after it. Here's a quick example of that, just to help you with an example. Ego habeo multam pecuniam, sed tu habes plus pecuniae. So hopefully you can follow along here. Again, try to translate these before I do and see what you can come up with, and I'll tell you the translation. Maybe pause it for a second. You can always do that, and that's the beauty of the video here. But I have much money, but you have plus pecuniae, more money. What's the construction here? This is the partitive genitive, more money. Yeah. Now, the other word we learned for more in this chapter was plures plura, which is kind of weird because it's an adjective. Plus is a noun, the singular, but in the plural, you use the adjective plures plura. And that's why it looks like it has plural endings. Now, what does it decline like? It's a third declension word. That's why these endings look third declension. Third declension masculine, feminine, third declension neuter. So this would decline plures, plurium, pluribus, plures, pluribus, just like a third declension word always has. This would be neuter third declension. So plura, plurium, pluribus, plura, pluribus. Okay, and this is where we get the word plural, like we talked about yesterday. This one is only used for plural nouns. So this is the one where you're saying we need more quizzes. I'm sure you guys are saying that all the time. This is where you'd use plures. So here's an example. Ego habeo multos equos, sed tu habes plures equos. The only difference between this sentence and the last one is that instead of more money, now you have more horses. So notice how this word is plural, so plures is used. By the way, plures is an adjective. It's not followed by partitive genitive. Plus is, but plures is not. So what case did I make both of these? Plures equos. These are both accusative. Okay, so that's important. They're accusative because they're the direct object of the sentence, the direct object of habes. There's the translation, by the way. So just kind of some specification there about when to use plus, when to use plures. Now this is a big chapter, right? There's not that much grammar, but there's a lot of vocab. Make sure if one of these things is not making perfect sense to you, you come in and show me your problems in the office hours so that I can help you with these before we get to our next quiz on this. I want you guys to nail this chapter. You know, it is an important one. We've been dealing with these comparative things for a while now. It's a big unit of Latin too. A few idioms this chapter that you're going to be seeing. One of them is maior natu. Now, literally, this means greater by birth, but idiomatically, it means older. There's actually two ways to say older in Latin. The word for old is senex, which was our vocab from yesterday. And there's also the comparative, which is senior, which can mean older. This is, however, another way to say older. It's an idiom that can also mean the same thing. And I'll show you an action in an example here. Pompeius erat maior natu quam Caesar. So this is about Pompey. Pompey was older than Caesar, which was true, by the way. So again, this is idiomatic because you don't translate it literally. You don't translate it greater by birth. You translate it he was older than Caesar. Now, the other idiom in this chapter is kind of related, maximus natu, literally greatest by birth, but the better translation, the idiomatic translation, is oldest. And this one's even more important because there is no superlative form of senex. There isn't one. There's not senissimus. That doesn't exist. So this is the only way to say oldest in Latin. So trium fratrum Quintus erat maximus natu. Of the three brothers, Quintus was the oldest, right? So this is the adjective modifying Quintus. It's the idiom here, of course, meaning oldest. And there's our English. So just a couple things to keep in mind. Again, as you study this vocab, these are some idioms you'll be seeing using the vocab. Now, we did our vocab yesterday, but I just wanted to highlight a few words we may not have thought of, or I guess did not think of yesterday. I did some more digging into the vocab. I think this word I did bring up, ameliorate, comes from melior, meaning better. Ameliorate means to make something better or more tolerable. So if you ameliorate the situation, you're improving it. That's a good word to know. I'd say that's a fairly common word. Some other words would be minuscule. This one comes from minimus, meaning very small or smallest. Minuscule can, nowadays it just means like very small. Oh, this thing is minuscule. There is a meaning though, that you don't hear as much anymore though, but referring to something written in small letters rather than capital letters, minuscule. But nowadays it more commonly just means very small. The phrase de minimis is a phrase that means something lacks significance or importance. In other words, it's so minor it can be disregarded. This is de minimis. It's almost not even worth paying attention to. That's a Latin phrase used in English sometimes. Nonplussed, this is a word you might have heard. Someone might say, I was nonplussed by this or something. If you're nonplussed or if you nonplus someone, it means you cause someone to be at a loss. They don't even know what to do, right? What does it literally mean? Not more, right? So nonplussed means there's nothing more to say. You don't know what more to do in the situation. If you're nonplussed by an issue, you're kind of out of words. You don't know what to do with it. So that's a cool word. You'll probably hear at some point. So those are some advanced derivatives you can put in your vocabulary section. And to finish up, I also wanted to go over with you guys the Sententia Antiquae this time. Sententia Antiquae we've done a few times in class. These are kind of the Latin sentences that are from real Roman authors using stuff from this chapter, and it'll give you just some good examples and some good practice with this stuff. And also getting ready for Latin 3, where you'll translate authentic Latin more often. Okay. So the next one is raro sinex mutat sententiam. The first one, this is a medieval phrase. We don't know exactly who to attribute it to, but it's a medieval phrase. It's kind of a cool one. Now, what's the word from this chapter? Because again, these will all have something from this chapter in them. So sinex is a word from this chapter meaning old. If it's used as a substantive, it can mean an old man or an old guy or old person or something. So this one means raro sinex mutat sententiam. Rarely does an old man mutat change his opinion or his mind. It's kind of interesting. We have a similar saying. You guys have ever heard the saying, can't teach an old dog new tricks? Kind of similar to that here. Rarely does an old man change his mind. Interesting. The next one is from a Roman author called Publilius Syrus, who had some interesting quotes and quotations. And he says, iracundiam qui vincit, holstim superat maximum. And I kind of like this one. It's a good sentiment here. What's the word from this chapter that we're seeing? Maximum. It's a superlative of magnus. We just went over that a few minutes ago. It's a superlative form. And the translation, qui vincit, he who conquers. What do you think iracundia means? Looks like ira, right? So this means like anger or ill temper. So he who conquers ill temper conquers superat, his greatest enemy. That's kind of a cool one. So you get control of your anger, you conquer your greatest enemy. And the next one is e pluribus unum. This one we actually had in Latin 1 as a phrase of the day, and it's on the dollar bill. It's kind of the unofficial motto of the U.S. It comes from what may have been written by Virgil. We're not 100% sure, but it's usually attributed to him, and it means literally one from many. And again, it's on the dollar bill because it's kind of supposed to represent different peoples coming together to form America. The word here from this chapter is pluribus, which means more or many in this case, kind of being used as a substantive, right? So that's from the word pluris we went over just a minute ago. Okay, so it's always good to do sententia, and I want to get you guys ready for Latin 3, where you will, sometimes be reading authentic Latin. Gets more popular in Latin 3 and 4, not popular, but more common in Latin 3 and 4. And excuse me, I need to mute something here. And lastly, I just wanted to go over a bit of culture with you that has some superlatives in it and words from this chapter. And it's a temple I've mentioned before, but I thought it's a good time to bring it up. It's the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And this is, most of the temple doesn't exist, just the very, very bottom foundations exist, but there's some ideas of what it may have looked like. And I bring this up because it's got two superlatives in it. Yoe means Jupiter, Optimo Maximo. Okay, so this is a superlative. It's dedicated to Jupiter, the best and greatest, right? So that's interesting temple name, Jupiter, the best and greatest, right? It also had two other goddesses who were honored inside this temple. They think it would have been Jupiter in the middle, and then also Juno and Minerva on either side of him. So there's a statue that I think was located in this temple. Again, the temple itself is mostly destroyed nowadays. But we have evidence of the temple. For example, here's an old coin where the temple was located. It's hard to tell in the picture, but they're able to look at coins like this nowadays and kind of make out things and use computers and cameras and lasers to make things out. And you can see the three statues if you look closely right here through the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Here's another coin with the temple on it. And like I mentioned, you can't make up much of the temple anymore, but this is what they think was the base of the temple, right? So there's just a very, very low foundations that they think may have been the temple, and it was located on the Capitoline Hill, which is one of the more prominent hills in Rome. The Capitoline and the Palatine probably be the two most famous, right? So a good time to bring up a little bit of culture there. And if you remember, we saw a recreation of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, one of our projects. Shout out to Arius, if you remember, who made that temple. That was one of the big projects in our room. Now, I do want to wrap up the chapter there, though. This is an important chapter. Again, the grammar, the constructions are not heavy this chapter, but the vocab is big. So make sure you start on vocab nice and early. You got to know the irregular comparison, also the words that have a comparative and superlative form, but lack a nominative form. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys today to study that and to practice that, and of course, the rest of this week we will start doing some practice and exercises to help you understand this chapter before we would ever quiz on it next week. Okay. Keep in touch. Pop in and see me at my office hours. I love seeing you guys during those. And I will be back tomorrow to work with you a little bit more on chapter 35. Well, later.